Welcome to Murdock's Music Minute and the chaos that I call my desk at home. Imagine you are interested in starting to listen to a band but are confronted with a discography of 20 plus studio albums. Where to start? Well, fear not, this might just be the list for beginners that you've been looking for. In my Getting Into series, I always pick an artist, a band, and suggest 5 albums from their regular studio releases that I think provide a good entry, a good overview of essential steps in the band's career, or that will just give you a taste of the style and the development of a band in order to find out if you then would like to really take the deep dive into their discography. Today, I'm yet one more time talking about a band that I've been listening to since my childhood, JETHRO Tull. And this is yet again another occasion where I repeat, cannot talk about this album here, which was my gateway, my first encounter with JETHRO Tull. Why not? Because this is a compilation, an early compilation that came out in 1972, gathering together, bringing together singles, single B-sides, material that was originally released as an acoustic EP, a bit of live recordings, etc. And the rules for my getting into selections say that I won't take any compilations or best-ofs or archival releases into consideration. So yet again, I cannot talk about JETHRO Tull's Living in the Past, a compilation that has just recently received a deluxe box set treatment. So yeah, that tells you, or should tell you, quite a bit about the status of this compilation. However, there is certainly enough material to choose from among Tull's regular studio albums. So let's get into the list. Here are my 5 picks for starters with JETHRO Tull. Tull had always been a band swimming against the tide, or at least moving on the fringes between various genres. Their roots go back as early as around 1964, 1965, when they played as briefly as, I think, a 7-piece band under the name of the John Evan Band. John Evans, their pianist and keyboarder, who, however, at the beginning, the official beginning of JETHRO Tull, wasn't a member of the band and would rejoin later on. The John Evan Band playing in clubs around Blackpool, so the area of the north of England. They played R&B, blues, a bit of jazz, even a little bit of Motown, though at least according to band interviews, none of them were really fans of soul music. And in order to be rebooked by various clubs, they kept changing their name from week to week. And at one point, simply, they came up with JETHRO Tull. If you can trust the memory of Ian Anderson, it was more or less a joke throwaway name, but when they the week they played as JETHRO Tull, they were more or less discovered, and so the name JETHRO Tull remained with them ever since. This band moniker choice, the name of actually, I think, 17th or 18th century agriculturist from England, also shows a bit of eccentricity and something that was not really rooted in American blues or rock and roll or anything that was hip and cool in the mid-60s, but something more earthy, something very English and something a little bit quirky. And all those elements should come to the fore rather soon in the development of Jethro Tull. They were signed by the new Chrysalis label, became the first big act for Chrysalis, and more or less the very reason Chrysalis could survive in the first years of the label. And they started out as a kind of jazzy, slightly eccentric blues rock band. This can be heard on their debut album, This Was, but very soon their style would change and evolve. At this stage in the band's career, one still had more or less two main figures in the band. On the one hand, the blues guitarist Mick Abrahams, and on the other hand, the more eccentric, idiosyncratic Ian Anderson, who had exchanged his guitar for a flute and who enjoyed playing the flute preferably on one leg. This was a combination that couldn't last long. Mick Abrahams left the group already after the first album. Allegedly, he wasn't very keen on touring outside of the UK, but what was more, there were the famous creative differences between him and Anderson and Anderson's vision, how he wanted the band to evolve. And while this debut album per se already is an interesting entry into late 60s UK blues rock and already sounds different from other blues rock groups, things really got interesting and unique from the band's second album onwards, in my opinion. And that second album would be my first suggestion to get started, to get into Jethro Tull. Released in 1969, Stand Up came with a beautiful album cover artwork mimicking something like, carvings. It also looks very 1969. The band here still had a slightly freaky hippie look, though Ian Anderson certainly was not a flower power child. Stand Up sees a young, curious band that has a lot of energy, also a lot of live energy, energy on stage, and at the same time is also willing to experiment a little bit with the common trends at the time, namely blues rock and the slowly appearing heavier rock. Stand Up presents the band already spreading their wings. They had a new guitarist, Martin Lancelot Barret, who would become the only constant member of the lineup besides Ian Anderson up until the late 90s, early 2000s. On Stand Up, one still gets vague blues elements, most notably on the album opener A New Day Yesterday, that however does something clever with a blues riff, so it's not your standard late 60s blues rocker. There are other tracks that already go into a heavier late 60s rock direction, for instance Back to the Family, which has a quite crunchy riff, or the album closing track for A Thousand Mothers. And in other places one can already hear Anderson's love for acoustic ditties and folk-inspired music. Jeffrey Goes to Leicester Square, the very tongue-in-cheek, almost Middle Eastern influenced Fat Man, or the very gorgeous, lush love ballad Reasons for Waiting. and that Tull also had a little bit of roots in jazz music and could possibly become interesting for the growing progressive rock movement can be heard on Bourrée, which is an adaptation from a Johann Sebastian Bach composition, here presented in a very groovy late 60s jazz rock style. A fantastic late 60s rock album with a few maybe unexpected ingredients or twists in the sound. Stand Up from 1969. With this sound, a very professional stage show, and most of all also Ian Anderson's sometimes outrageous stage antics combined with rather intelligent interviews, Jethro Tull quickly gained a lot of fans from the so-called rock underground scene, and I guess a lot of fans of that phase of Jethro Tull would have been quite happy if the band simply had gone on in this direction and in this style, but Ian Anderson being Ian Anderson, things more or less changed with almost each successive album, at least throughout the 1970s. The blues quickly disappeared, or only very vague traces of it can be heard in Tull's music after 1969. And in 1971, Anderson and Co. released an album that suddenly made the band appear as if they would be the next big thing, next to maybe Led Zeppelin or Deep Purple or other classic rock, heavier rock bands. It's their most famous album, their best-selling album to this day, I believe, and also the album that people usually know if they know any album by Jethro Tull. It's also my selection number 2 for Getting Into Tull, their 4th studio album, Aqualung. This album indeed has some of the heaviest rocking tracks in Tull's entire discography. However, there is also a lot of room for acoustic passages, even very short acoustic tracks or vignettes, as I would call them, sometimes even not longer than 2 minutes, very gentle, very beautiful songs by Ian Anderson. And then there's also an already strong progressive element, certainly in the title track, but also in the mammoth track that opens side 2 of the album, My God, which goes through various changes and has a quite eccentric, interesting break in the middle with a flute solo and kind of mock choir vocals. The album often was considered a concept album, much to the disagreement of Ian Anderson, who has never tired of explaining that Aqualung was not conceived as a concept album. If you listen to the album, it's certainly, well, it really isn't a concept album in the classic sense, but there is no denying that this is at least a thematic album dealing with certain topics that appear in various of the songs on this album. Other famous selections on here are the nasty rocker Cross-Eyed Mary and Tull's biggest hit, at least among classic rock fans, the famous Locomotive Breath. But basically all of the songs here could be part of a greatest hits package. But what you barely get with Jethro Tull is actually no-brainer, straightforward rock and roll, and Ian Anderson certainly decided that classic rock was not the direction he wanted to move into any further. And he already demonstrated that with the next studio album from 1972. It was his reaction to the constant press articles claiming that Aqualung was a concept album. And with that next release, which is my pick number 3 on the list, he wanted to show the audience and the critics what he understood under the name of a concept album. Thick as a Brick came with a hilarious cover artwork. The album was designed like a newspaper. You could actually, the original pressings, you could unfold the cover. There were several pages, very elaborate artwork, and that alone would have been probably enough to make this album stand out from other albums in 1972. But what is more is that Thick as a Brick basically consists of simply one single track that takes up the entire running time of a single record. So 42 minutes of music without any breaks, apart from the point where the listener needs to flip the record at the end of side 1. Of course, Anderson and the other band members also had a lot of fun with not only coming up with the very funny newspaper articles for the cover artwork, but also coming up with the concept behind Thick as a Brick. It's also explained on the very front cover of the album. They claimed that Thick as a Brick actually was a poet, so the lyrics to the whole music had been written by an 8-year-old child prodigy called Gerald Bostock, who won a poetry competition with those lyrics, but then was disqualified because the jury eventually was of the opinion that those lyrics were not acceptable and against Queen and Country, more or less. That's all very tongue-in-cheek, almost a bit of Monty Python humor, coupled with extremely technically high-level playing. Everything a proper progressive rock fan likes about progressive rock can be found on this album, and yet it is still extremely accessible. Anderson came up with little pieces, little chunks of music that could also more or less work on their own as separate pieces. And then the whole band developed transitional pieces to put all of the single elements of this huge long track together. So what actually seems like a super complex, lengthy composition are individual musical segments that are, however, cleverly linked with each other. Also, the music sometimes isn't maybe as complex as you might think as a listener, but the verve with which this is played and the technical level still is breathtaking, and Thick as a Brick certainly belongs among the very best that progressive rock in the 1970s has got to offer, even though it was conceived as a send-up of progressive rock. So this is also working on lots of meta levels here. A wonderful, brilliant album. Don't shy away or don't be intimidated by the very fact that this is apparently one long piece of music. I think you will enjoy Thick as a Brick if you have any interest in rock music, in progressive music, or even in more acoustic, folky stuff. So with this, and the previous album, Aqualung, Jethro Tull had become a huge stadium-filling band, not only in the UK and in Europe, but especially in the USA, and they would remain one of the biggest and most successful live acts in rock music during the entire 1970s. Thick as a Brick, however, for a lot of fans of the early Tull sound, was the point where they sort of jumped ship, but a lot of new fans came on board. For a while, Jethro Tull now were considered a very eclectic and eccentric progressive rock band. They emphasized this themselves with the follow-up to Thick as a Brick, another long one-track album, but a lot more seriously in approach. Also, maybe less melodious, more experimental and super complex, also according to guitarist Martin Barr. A passion play, which, however, could not really repeat the success of Thick as a Brick. And this was followed by a couple of very strong and interesting albums that combined progressive elements with rock elements, even a little bit of pop rock crept in the mid-70s. But my fourth selection to get into Jethro Tull actually is an album from 1977, marking the beginning of a very beloved album trilogy, also marking the beginning of a very distinct musical phase in the history of Jethro Tull, namely something that you could consider progressive folk or folky prog rock. Folk music had almost always been an element in Jethro Tull's music. Ian Anderson himself also has stated several times that he had been a fan of acoustic and especially of British folk music from his early years. But on 1977's Songs from the Wood, those British folk elements actually became the main sound or the very core of the music of Tull. But they didn't play simply old traditionals or folk music in the style of, say, Fairport Convention or Steel Eye Span or Irish folk like Clannad. They played a very idiosyncratic folk music that still catered to rock audiences and especially to prog rock audiences, because their artificial folk songs are extremely complex. They use time changes, sophisticated arrangements, and adventurous instruments. Songs from the Wood often is seen as a breath of fresh air in the discography of Jethro Tull. They followed this album with two more albums in this kind of prog folk style, but Songs from the Wood maybe is the most playful one of this album trio. It's also the one that utilizes English folklore the most. Mythical figures like the Jack in the Green, nature plays a big role, or an overall mystification of nature and living in the English countryside. The intricate harmony vocals alone on the title track, which also opens the album, are something that you don't get with most other rock bands. But then Tull add to that a very complex musical arrangement. At that point, David Palmer, later D. Palmer, had become an official member of the band's lineup. He had composed string arrangements on previous Tull albums and now joined the band as a second keyboard and organ player. There's a lot of intricate, challenging rhythmic arrangements going on, also some counterpoint playing. The band also seems to be a bit influenced by progressive rockers such as Gentle Giant on this album, but as mentioned, play this style with a very strong root in English folk music. Despite this heady, cerebral musical approach, Anderson never loses sight of very gorgeous tunes and melodies. Jack in the Green is a shorter, more concise acoustic folk rocker. Cup of Wonder has a beautiful vocal melody. Velvet Green sounds as if a troupe of Elizabethan musicians time traveled to a progressive rock recording studio of the 1970s. This is really a unique track, even among other progressive rock bands. Ring Out Solstice Bells was an unlikely heathen Christmas single. The Whistler here is the catchy tune for an evening at the Irish pub. And the epic Pibroch, cap in hand, gives Martin Barr a bit of space to play around with effects and a really heavy, unexpectedly heavy guitar tone. Songs from the Wood from 1977. The success of this album made sure that Jethro Tull remained a mainstay in rock and progressive rock during also the second half of the 70s. They became an even larger live act, selling out stadiums around the world in seconds' time. But at the end of the 1970s, a chapter seemed to come to a close. The more or less classic lineup of the band, though Jethro Tull's lineup had been prone to changes ever since the formation of the group, but the classic lineup that had remained stable more or less during the time from 1972 to 1979 broke up or was disbanded. There are various versions how this happened, and ever since, Jethro Tull's lineup has remained a kind of revolving door with, as mentioned, Ian Anderson being the only constant member and the undisputed mastermind of the band. Even Martin Barr, the beloved and somewhat underrated guitarist, left the group in, I believe, the early 2000s, if I remember correctly. And well, the 80s, of course, were a decade where folk music, progressive rock really went out of fashion, and even an idiosyncratic band such as Jethro Tull had to, change their style. Also, Ian Anderson just wanted to try out different things. There's a phase that can almost be considered new wave or electronic rock music in Tull's discography, though a certain folk element never left the songwriting of Ian Anderson. And in the second half of the 80s, Tull's sound became more straightforward again. It could be considered a kind of sophisticated hard rock with a bit of folk and prog elements. And in recent years, Anderson has even returned after a very long hiatus with a new band lineup and has released new albums under the name of Jethro Tull, still sort of blending hard rock, a bit of prog rock and folk elements, but now in a more subdued, dare I say it, elderly version of Jethro Tull. But to give you as, my final entry on the Getting into Jethro Tull list, to give you an idea of the sort of latter-day Jethro Tull sound, I've picked the album Roots to Branches, which I have to check one more time, which I think came out in 1995. So looking back at it now, one almost has to say that this is sort of from the later middle period of Tull. But for me, This one already belongs into the category of latter-day works. Roots to Branches. When it came out, it was celebrated by some critics as a bit of a return, a comeback, a return to form for Tull. Other fans would maybe say that this is not their most essential album, but as mentioned, I think this gives you a good idea of that latter day sound, which still is a bit proggy, but also a bit more straightforward, not as elaborate or complex as their 1970s epics. There's a good dose of riffing going on, so it's a kind of elderly statesman hard rock. And what also sets this album apart from other maybe similar albums in the Jethro Tull catalog is a very strong Eastern influence, an influence of music from India. During that time, Ian Anderson preferred to play a bamboo flute, so also his flute sound is a bit different from the more aggressive stabbing flute playing that he sported in the late 60s and the 70s. So this is all very elegant, very skillful music, but still with a certain edge. Especially songs in the first half have some quite interesting riffs going on. Still, Martin Barr here is a member of the band. Roots to Branches, with its slightly mystical, droning, meandering vocal line, beautifully sets the tone and mood for this album. Rare and Precious Chain has some really rocking moments, at least comparatively rocking moments, given that this was a really long established and, as mentioned, a little bit aging rock group. Valley is quite catchy and even blends a bluesy acoustic guitar lick with those Indian influences. Dangerous Wheels is one of the heavier rockers, and in the second half, Tull add a jazzy element with kind of, well, sophisticated jazz rock, slightly proggy ballads. Beside Myself, for example, Wounded Old and Treacherous, or At Last Forever, which is a quite heartfelt ballad about aging and dying, basically. But as mentioned, the story of Jethro Tull didn't end there. At the moment, they are still active or active again, but start with the 5 albums I have just mentioned. And with this one here. But don't tell anybody, because it's a compilation. And if you're wondering now, well, for this getting into list, didn't Murdock simply give us his personal top 5 Jethro Tull albums? You can compare that, if you've got a little bit of time, here in my old but apparently quite popular Jethro Tull ranking video. That's all the Tull I've got for you today, but if you enjoy those 5 albums, you certainly should go deeper into their discography, because those 5 are not the only ones that I think are great albums. Let me know which 5 albums you would pick for starters if you are an expert in Jethro Tull. Thanks for watching. Stay tuned for another Murdock Music Minute, but most of all, happy discovering if you are a Jethro Tull newbie, and thanks for supporting the channel. Bye bye. See you again.